Hi everybody, my name is Samantha and I'm here to discuss employee handbooks and training with you. What we're going to cover really briefly is we're going to go over employee handbook contents, the purpose of having an employee handbook, basic requirements within a handbook by law, and other topics that should be covered in an employee handbook. And then we're going to move on to employee training and implementing a program for small business. First off, we're going to start with employee handbook development. I feel that it's important to point out that it's really not required by law that you have an employee handbook. However, it is recommended based on the fact that an employee handbook offers protection for both the employee and the employer, and it helps to create communication between the two. And I'll touch on that a little bit more here in a moment. But it's important that the policies in the employee handbook always reflect the everyday functions of a company. And of course, these specific policies will vary business to business and general nature of the company. The best way to ensure that a handbook reflects what actually happens within the company is to have all the employees involved and allow them to give feedback on the policies included in the handbook. It's also important to have an employment lawyer or an HR representative to review the handbook to ensure that all legal requirements have been met prior to the publication of the handbook. Now we're going to go back and we're going to touch on why it's important to have an employee handbook. An employee handbook works as an important part of the communication between employer and employee by detailing out exactly what is expected of each party. This actually protects both the employer and the employee by outlining it all and making it accessible at all times. Even when your supervisor or your department manager may not be on site, you have that employee handbook that you can refer to. And while you still may have questions, it will at least offer you some insight into the problem at hand. Handbook contents and required policies. Policies that are recommended by state or federal law, which should be included in your handbook should you choose to have one. There's actually quite a few of them. We're just going to go over a very short list here, but it includes your anti-discrimination policies, harassment policies, non-disclosure policies, compensation, FMLA and other leave policies, and your safety and security policies. Other policies and sections that may be included in an employee handbook could be your standard or code of conduct, work schedules, employee benefits, media relations, or computer and technology use. Now this is going to depend on the type of business. If you run a restaurant, you may not need media relations, or you may need media relations depending on the type of restaurant it is. You may have to have a computer and technology use policy depending on what your employees are doing. So that's something to take into account, that it's going to have to be up to the business owner to decide what's appropriate to go into the handbook when it comes to these types of policies. But it's still important to make sure that when writing these policies that it gives a clear and concise picture of what is expected from the employee and what the employee can expect from their company. Now, once you have gone through the phases of researching what's required by law, getting your employees' feedback on the policies that you're going to include in the handbook, and an HR representative has either reviewed it or you've had a lawyer review it, and all your revisions have been made, you've sent it off to the publisher, and now you have a big box of employee handbooks. So now you have to worry about the distribution of these handbooks. Every employee must receive a copy of the handbook, and it is to the company's benefit to make sure that each employee is asked that once they've read the employee handbook, that they sign a form stating that they've read, understand, and agree to follow the policies in the handbook. This offers that legal protection for both the employee and the employer. And since you have it in writing, that can go into the employee's file, and if there ever is any litigation, that can be brought up to either party's defense. So now we're going to move on to employee training programs. Employee training is an ongoing process which starts with a new employee and they're in orientation and then continues throughout their time of employment. What we're going to discuss is the types of trainings that are required, how it should be implemented, and systems that allow for constant tracking of training records. The amount of training required and the frequency will depend on the company's policies, the legal requirements for the state in which the company is located, as well as federal requirements. Starting an employee training program. Most small businesses don't start up with a training program in place right off the bat. And a lot of times that means that the company is required to backtrack as the business grows to create a employee training program and a training matrix in order to keep up with it all. To begin a training program can be very time consuming and very costly, so it's important that the business owner assess this and decide whether this is something that they want to do on their own or if it would be more cost and time effective to bring in a specialist who works as a contractor to help create and implement these training programs. In the case that an owner decides to start their own program, it's crucial that they be familiar with all state and federal requirements for their particular type of business. This is going to differ depending on what type of business you're running. If you're running a restaurant, you're going to have a lot of different legal requirements than if you're running a machine shop. So it's important to be completely aware of what applies and does not apply to you. After a list of all the training mandated by federal and state legislation is made, a list should be made to cover each job an employee may perform for the company, including processing of invoices, any safety concerns, and things of that nature. You can then further break this down into a list of what's considered soft skills. Soft skills are defined as your policies, including your harassment policies, safety policies, and general topics. And then you can also divide it into hard skills, which are your specific job skills, such as machine operation. Once a list of the training has been made, you need to match that up with the employees that need that training. So it's important to make sure that each employee receives the correct training. To do this, it's usually easiest to make a matrix or a list of each employee using their name and the training that they need to perform their jobs. In today's world, we have a lot of options for doing this. You can either do this on paper, you can do this through a program such as Excel, which is easily accessible to most business owners, or you can opt for going the more expensive route and get some of these more expensive programs which are meant to do this for you. Once you've entered in the employee and their job title, it will automatically populate the various trainings that they would need to go through. But this is entirely up to the employer and business owner as to which way that they want to go. Small businesses typically use either Excel or training checklists, which are your standard good old hard copies. Some training is going to apply to all employees. Others will only need a brief introduction into some areas, and other employees are going to need extensive training into these topics. And it's important when you're making this matrix to realize who is going to benefit the most from each training. If you have a secretary or someone who is handling your purchasing, they're not really going to benefit that much from the lockout tagout training that someone working in your machine shop may benefit from. So it's important to realize what is going to apply to who. And that's not talking about your soft skills. Your soft skills, for the most part, are going to include your policies, and that's going to apply to almost everyone. But at the same point, your purchasing representative who's going to be taking care of your invoices is going to need that invoice training, whereas your person working on the shop floor is not going to need that. So we have to make sure that we're providing the correct training to the correct people. And this matrix allows you to do that. And by doing it in Excel, you're able to quickly search for each person's name, where that's not exactly available in your checklists, but it is all up to the employer. What I've provided here is an example of a checklist. This particular checklist is a safety training checklist from the MSU Department of Horticulture. It's just a brief idea. This is not going to match every company, as of course, horticulture is a very broad field, and they're using a lot of different types of machinery that a lot of other businesses are not going to touch. So you have to be aware of the differences, but this is just to give you a very brief idea of what you would be looking at if you chose to do a checklist. Now, what I do recommend is I recommend actually doing both. I recommend having a physical checklist to keep in an employee's file as a hard copy, and to have some form of electronic copy, because we both know it's always a possibility that something will happen and one of those is going to disappear. So it's just best to be prepared. But this really gives you the basics of what you're going to need. Now, once you've developed this program, you have to implement it. So proper implementation is something that for an existing small business can be a little bit of a rocky start. For new hires, it's pretty easy. You have a new hire come in, and during that first week, they really kind of go ahead and get their orientation, and all of that training can kind of be put into play there. So you really don't have to worry too much with that, because that first week is when they're going to be learning it all anyway. That is their first training week. So you're able to implement this with new hires very easily. But for existing employees, it's a little bit harder, because what you have to do is you have to make sure that you get this training. Once you've implemented the program, you have to get everyone caught up to speed. And that does make it a little bit hard when it interrupts your production. But it's important to get this done as soon as possible. Once you've made the start with a employee training, you have to make sure that everyone is brought up to speed as quickly as possible. So you may want to schedule this during a slower time in your business, if there is such a thing. I know for many there isn't, but this is something that you have to consider. It's also important to note here, especially with time being a consideration, that these trainings don't have to be anything fancy. They don't have to be a huge multimedia presentation. They don't have to be an all-day training course. It can be as simple as having a designated employee going over materials using handouts. A lot of companies do this. Some companies even have one particular person who is dedicated to doing, for example, safety training. This person is a lot of times called the safety person, and they're responsible for the safety training. So that is a prime example of just a designated employee going over mandated materials. However, it is important to recognize that all training that is conducted must be recorded, and it must show that the employee understands the subject matter, agrees to follow the policy, and is competent enough to do so. This is, of course, to protect both the employee and the employer. This shows that the training did happen and that the employee was there, and that they agreed to follow the policies. This can also go the other way. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. So it's important to make sure that you have everything lined up when you're implementing this. And it can be difficult to implement a training program, as simple as it sounds. It's not always easy. So I hope this has offered you a little bit of insight into what employee handbooks need to contain, and employee training and how to develop a program. These are some resources that I found that were helpful in my search when I was trying to kind of get a foothold in this, and I hope that they are of some help to you. And I hope you all have a lovely day. Thank you.